Western Front, Flanders Sector, November 1916, 0430 hours, and Gefreiter Hans Müller of the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment stands in a fire step carved into frozen mud, his hands wrapped around a Gewehr 98 rifle that's become an extension of his body after 18 months in the trenches. The pre-dawn darkness presses around him like a physical weight, broken only by the occasional star shell that transforms no man's land into a brief snapshot of hell, illuminating the wire, the shell craters, and the bodies that hang on the barbed wire like grotesque scarecrows. Müller has been awake for 3 hours already, standing in water that reaches his ankles despite the duckboards beneath his feet, watching the British lines 200 metres away for any sign of a raiding party. What Müller knows with absolute certainty, what every German soldier learns within days of arriving at the front, is that survival in the trenches depends not on heroism or even courage, but on 3 things: rigid discipline, constant vigilance, and the ability to endure conditions that would break most men within a week. The German trench system that Müller inhabits represents the most sophisticated defensive network in military history, a product of engineering expertise and tactical doctrine refined through 2 years of brutal warfare. Unlike the hastily dug ditches that characterized the opening months of the war, these trenches form an elaborate 3-line system stretching from the coast to Switzerland, each line positioned to support the others, each designed according to specifications that account for drainage, fields of fire, and protection from artillery. The front-line trench where Müller stands measures 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, with a fire step that allows soldiers to shoot over the parapet while remaining protected. Behind this front line, 200 yards back, runs the support trench, connected by communication trenches that zigzag to prevent enfilade fire. Another 400 yards behind that sits the reserve trench, where resting units wait to reinforce the forward positions or counter-attack any breakthrough. The entire system includes concrete bunkers called Stollen, command posts reinforced with steel, aid stations, ammunition dumps, and even underground barracks where men can sleep relatively protected from shell fire. The construction of these trenches consumed millions of man-hours, with German soldiers spending as much time digging and reinforcing as they did fighting. Unteroffizier Friedrich Weber, a section leader in the 120th Infantry Regiment, oversees a working party of 8 men who labour throughout the night, strengthening a section of parapet damaged by British artillery. They work methodically, filling sandbags with earth excavated from the trench floor, stacking them in precise patterns that Weber has memorised from engineering manuals, creating walls that can absorb shell fragments and small arms fire. The work never ends, because the trenches exist in constant state of decay. Walls collapsing under rain, duckboards sinking into mud, drainage ditches filling with debris. Weber drives his men relentlessly, knowing that a weak section of trench can mean the difference between survival and annihilation when the British artillery opens fire. The discipline that governs this work reflects the fundamental German military philosophy that systematic preparation prevents casualties, that properly maintained defences save lives. German military discipline in the trenches operates according to principles established by generations of Prussian military tradition, modified by the brutal realities of industrial warfare. Every soldier knows his assigned position, his specific duties, the chain of command that connects him to the battalion commander. Morning stand-to requires every man at his post 1 hour before dawn, weapons loaded, watching for the attack that British doctrine dictates should come in the pre-dawn darkness. The ritual repeats every morning without variation, regardless of whether intelligence suggests an attack is likely, because discipline demands consistency, and consistency builds the automatic responses that save lives when shells start falling. Hauptmann Ernst Junger, commanding a company of the 73rd Hanoverian Fusilier Regiment, conducts daily inspections that scrutinize everything from rifle cleanliness to the condition of gas masks, imposing immediate punishment for any deficiency. A rusted rifle bolt means 2 hours of extra sentry duty. A torn gas mask earns a soldier assignment to the most dangerous listening post in no man's land. These punishments seem petty to new recruits, but veterans understand that Junger's obsessive attention to detail keeps men alive when gas clouds roll across no man's land, or when a rifle must fire without jamming during a British assault. The German military justice system maintains order through a combination of formal discipline and what soldiers call Kameradschaft, the brotherhood that binds men together under fire. Germany executed 48 soldiers during World War I, far fewer than the British who executed over 300, or the French who shot 600 to 800 men. This relatively lenient approach reflects German military theory that unit cohesion matters more than fear of execution, that soldiers fight more effectively when they trust their officers and believe in the system. Feldwebel Otto Schmidt, a platoon sergeant with 20 years of service, administers discipline according to this philosophy, using punishment details and public reprimands to maintain order, while reserving courts-martial for only the most serious offences. When Gefreiter Karl Becker falls asleep on sentry duty, Schmidt assigns him to latrine detail for a week, rather than reporting him to the company commander, understanding that exhaustion caused the lapse, rather than cowardice or defiance. But when Becker makes the same mistake a second time, Schmidt has no choice but to report him, and Becker faces a court-martial that results in 6 months hard labour at a military prison behind the lines. The system works because soldiers understand the rules and know that punishment follows infractions with mathematical certainty. Fear in the German trenches manifests itself differently than popular imagination suggests, not as constant terror, but as a low-grade anxiety that permeates every moment, occasionally spiking into pure panic when shells start falling or when orders arrive for an assault. Musketeer Paul Baumer, a 19-year-old soldier in his first month at the front, describes the fear as a physical presence that sits in his stomach like a stone, making it difficult to eat, interfering with sleep even during the brief rest periods. He watches veteran soldiers for signs of how to cope, learning that they've developed rituals and habits that provide psychological armour against the constant threat of death. Some smoke constantly, burning through their tobacco ration in days and trading anything they have for more cigarettes. Others write letters home every evening, filling pages with trivial details about the weather or their health, avoiding any mention of the fear that dominates their thoughts. Still others adopt a fatalistic attitude that Bäumer finds both comforting and disturbing. Men who claim that every shell has an address written on it, that if your name is on a particular piece of shrapnel, there's nothing you can do to avoid it, so why worry? The routine of trench life provides structure that helps soldiers manage fear by giving them tasks to focus on, rather than dwelling on mortality. The general pattern involved 4 days in the front line, 4 days in close reserve, and 4 days at rest, though this rotation varied depending on sector activity and troop availability. During frontline duty, soldiers follow a schedule that leaves little time for contemplation. Morning stand to at dawn, breakfast of ersatz coffee and bread, equipment inspection, maintenance work on the trenches, lunch, afternoon sentry rotations, evening stand to at dusk, dinner, night patrols or working parties, and finally a few hours of fitful sleep before the cycle begins again. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann, a platoon commander, maintains a pocket watch that he consults obsessively, keeping his men on schedule, ensuring sentries change at precise intervals, timing artillery barrages to coordinate with battalion headquarters. This obsession with time and routine serves a purpose beyond mere efficiency, providing psychological reassurance that the chaos of war can be managed and controlled through discipline and organisation. Life in reserve trenches offers relative relief from the immediate threat of enemy action, though soldiers remain within range of British artillery and must maintain readiness to reinforce the front line at any moment. Gefreiter Anton Schneider, resting in a reserve dugout after 4 days in the front line, describes the strange mixture of relief and continued anxiety that characterises these rest periods. The relief comes from being able to remove his boots for the first time in days, to sleep lying down rather than sitting against a trench wall, to eat a hot meal prepared in field kitchens rather than cold rations consumed under fire. But the anxiety never completely disappears, because everyone knows that the sound of whistles, or the runner arriving with urgent messages, means immediate return to the front line, possibly into the middle of a British attack. Schneider spends his rest time cleaning his rifle with methodical care, stripping it completely, removing every trace of mud and rust, oiling each component before reassembly. This maintenance ritual provides both practical benefit and psychological comfort, giving him control over at least one aspect of his existence in the trenches. The physical conditions in German trenches varied enormously depending on sector, season, and the tactical situation, but certain elements remained constant regardless of location. Soldiers faced constant exposure to wetness causing trench foot, while infectious diseases such as dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever were common and spread rapidly in the close quarters. Sanitätsgefreiter Ernst Toller, a medical orderly attached to the 18th Infantry Regiment, treats an endless stream of patients suffering from ailments that have nothing to do with enemy action. Trench foot afflicts men whose boots remain wet for days, the flesh of their feet turning white and swollen, then black as tissue dies, requiring amputation in severe cases. Toller inspects feet daily, ordering men to remove their boots and socks, to rub their feet with whale oil when available, to change into dry socks if they have them, But these preventive measures prove inadequate against the persistent dampness that characterizes trench life, especially during the autumn and winter months when rain turns trenches into canals and soldiers stand in water for days at a time. Dysentery sweeps through units with devastating regularity, caused by contaminated water, poor sanitation, and the impossibility of maintaining hygiene standards in trenches that serve as living quarters, fighting positions, and latrine facilities simultaneously. The disease turns strong soldiers into weakened shells within days, leaving them unable to perform their duties as they run constantly to the latrines, losing weight and strength with each bout of diarrhea. Toller administers what treatments he has, mostly opium-based medications that provide temporary relief, but the only real cure involves removal from the trenches to hospitals in the rear, a luxury the army cannot afford when every man is needed to hold the line. He watches men sicken and die not from British bullets, but from microscopic organisms that thrive in the filth of trench warfare, victims of an enemy that shows no mercy and respects no armistice. The relationship between German soldiers and their officers differs fundamentally from the British model, reflecting cultural attitudes toward authority and the professional nature of the German officer corps. Hauptmann von Hentig, commanding the 2nd Company of the 211th Reserve Infantry Regiment, maintains a formal distance from his men that seems harsh to observers, but actually strengthens unit cohesion by reinforcing the chain of command. He addresses enlisted men only through their non-commissioned officers, never eating with them or sharing their dugouts, maintaining the social distance that German military tradition considers essential to proper command. But von Hentig also demonstrates the professional competence that earns respect from his soldiers, leading from the front during attacks, ensuring his men receive their rations before he eats, visiting wounded soldiers in the aid station, writing personal letters to the families of men killed under his command. This combination of formal distance and demonstrated care creates loyalty that cannot be ordered or enforced, binding soldiers to their officers through mutual respect rather than mere fear of punishment. The non-commissioned officers form the backbone of the German army, professional soldiers who've spent years learning their trade, men who understand that their survival depends on the competence of their subordinates. Feldwebel Heinrich Koch, a section leader with 15 years' service, has survived 2 years of trench warfare through a combination of skill, luck, and ruthless attention to detail. He knows his men by name, understands their strengths and weaknesses, assigns them tasks according to their abilities. When selecting men for a patrol into no man's land, Koch chooses not the bravest, but the most careful, soldiers who can move silently, who think before acting, who will follow his orders exactly, without initiative that might compromise the mission. He spends hours briefing them before the patrol, walking them through every step, showing them diagrams of the British trenches drawn by previous patrols, describing the location of enemy machine gun posts and listening posts. This meticulous preparation characterizes German small unit leadership, the understanding that survival comes from planning rather than heroic improvisation. Night patrols into no man's land represent one of the most terrifying duties soldiers face, requiring men to leave the relative safety of the trenches and venture into a landscape illuminated by unpredictable star shells, where British sentries watch for movement. Gefreiter Ludwig Frank, selected for a patrol by Feldwebel Koch, blackens his face with mud to eliminate any shine, checks his grenades and bayonet, leaves behind his identification papers and anything that might identify his unit to British intelligence if he's captured. The patrol consists of 6 men, moving in single file through gaps in the German wire, crawling across shell-torn ground toward the British lines 200 meters away. Frank focuses on the ground immediately in front of him, moving when star shells die out, freezing when light floods the landscape, barely breathing as British machine guns sweep no man's land with predetermined fire patterns. The mission takes 3 hours to cover 200 meters, reach a position where they can observe British trench activity, and return safely. Frank experiences more concentrated fear during these 3 hours than during days of artillery bombardment, the knowledge that discovery means almost certain death sharpening every sense until he feels he can hear individual heartbeats. The development of elite assault units called Stoßtruppen or Sturmtruppen represents German adaptation to trench warfare stalemate, creating specialized soldiers trained to break through defensive positions that conventional infantry cannot penetrate. Stormtroopers specialized in commando-style raids, infiltrating trenches and wiping out the enemy quickly, using maneuver warfare, reconnaissance, and shock tactics. Unteroffizier Joseph Roth, selected for training with a Sturmbattalion in early 1917, undergoes an intensive course that transforms him from a conventional infantry soldier into something resembling a modern special forces operator. The training emphasizes initiative over obedience, teaching small unit leaders to make independent decisions based on battlefield conditions rather than blindly following orders. Roth learns to use weapons that ordinary infantry never see. Flamethrowers that project burning fuel 30 meters, light machine guns that can be carried by one man, bags of grenades for clearing trenches, Mauser pistols for close-quarters fighting in dugouts. The training builds physical endurance through forced marches and assault courses, psychological toughness through realistic combat simulations, and tactical flexibility through problems that have no single correct solution. When Roth returns to the front as part of a Stostrup assault team, he finds himself living according to different rules than conventional infantry. Stormtroopers receive better rations, more leave, exemption from routine trench duties, privileges that reflect their elite status, but also the high casualties they suffer during assaults. Roth's unit trains constantly when not in action, practicing assault tactics against mock trenches, coordinating with artillery observers to request precise fire support, rehearsing the infiltration tactics that define their role. Instead of attacking over the whole width, they assault key points, enter the trenches, and fight their way inside and alongside the trenches, opening holes and flowing through the trench system. This represents a revolutionary change from the mass assaults that characterized the war's first 2 years, replacing waves of infantry that present perfect targets with small groups that exploit gaps in enemy defences. Food in the German trenches becomes increasingly scarce as the war progresses, and the British blockade strangles supply lines, transforming meals from sustenance into obsession. Gefreiter Max Reimann, who enlisted in 1914, remembering the adequate rations of the war's first year, now subsists on portions that leave him constantly hungry. Breakfast consists of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns or barley, a substance that tastes nothing like real coffee, but provides hot liquid that warms cold bodies. The bread ration, once substantial, has been cut repeatedly until soldiers receive perhaps 200 grams per day. Dark bread that contains sawdust and potato flour, mixed with whatever grain the army can acquire. Lunch, when it arrives in containers carried from field kitchens, brings watery soup made from dehydrated vegetables, occasionally containing tiny amounts of meat that soldiers fish out eagerly. Dinner offers more bread, sometimes margarine or jam if supplies permit, perhaps a piece of sausage that tastes mostly of fat and grain. The official ration provides perhaps 2,000 calories per day, barely sufficient for men performing hard physical labour in cold conditions, forcing soldiers to supplement their diet with packages from home, items purchased from local farmers when rear area duty permits, or food stolen from supply depots. The hunger affects everything, dominating conversations during quiet periods, as soldiers reminisce about meals they ate before the war, describing in loving detail the schnitzel and potatoes, the sausages and sauerkraut, the pastries and cakes that seem impossibly distant now. Gefreiter Reimann writes letters home, begging his mother to send anything she can spare, describing his constant hunger in terms he hopes will move her to action without triggering censorship. When packages arrive from home, soldiers treat them like sacred objects, carefully rationing the contents to make them last as long as possible, sharing with close comrades who have no one to send them packages. This food sharing strengthens the bonds between men, creating obligations and relationships that define trench life as much as military discipline does. The rats constitute another constant presence in the trenches, thriving on the combination of food waste, unburied bodies, and the warm shelter that trenches provide. Musketeer Heinrich Becker describes waking to find rats crawling across his body as he sleeps, enormous creatures grown fat on corpses, fearless from constant human contact. The rats swarm at night, their rustling and squeaking creating a background noise that soldiers learn to ignore, though everyone retains a visceral horror of the vermin. Attempts to control the rat population prove futile, as poison only kills a fraction of them, and the constant supply of corpses in no man's land ensures new generations appear as quickly as old ones die. Soldiers develop a grudging coexistence with the rats, using sticks to beat them away from food supplies, accepting their presence as one more aspect of trench life that must be endured rather than fought. Lice prove even more troublesome than rats because they live on soldiers' bodies, breeding in the seams of uniforms, causing constant itching and spreading typhus. Every soldier becomes infested within days of arriving at the front, the lice passing from man to man in the close quarters of trenches and dugouts. Gefreiter Schmidt spends hours hunting lice in his uniform, running his thumbnail along seams to crush the insects in their eggs, knowing that tomorrow will bring new generations to replace those he kills. The itching drives men to distraction, making sleep difficult, causing soldiers to scratch until they draw blood, creating wounds that become infected. When units rotate to rest areas, they receive opportunities to delouse, stripping naked and placing their uniforms in steam chambers that kill lice and eggs. But within days of returning to the trenches, the lice return, carried from other soldiers or hatching from eggs that survived the steam treatment. The arrival of mail represents one of the few bright moments in trench life, bringing news from home that connects soldiers to the world beyond the trenches. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hofer waits eagerly for the mail orderly's arrival, hoping for letters from his wife and children, news that tells him life continues normally despite the war. When letters arrive, he reads them repeatedly, memorizing every detail, trying to picture his children growing up in his absence, imagining his wife managing the farm without him. The letters speak of mundane concerns, crop yields and children's illnesses, neighbours' gossip and food shortages, topics that would have seemed boring before the war, but now represent connection to normalcy. Hofer writes back carefully, describing trench life in terms that won't alarm his family or trigger censorship, trying to reassure his wife, while simultaneously expressing the loneliness and fear he cannot share with his comrades. These letters become his anchor to sanity, reminding him that another life waits beyond the trenches if he can only survive long enough to return to it. The German army's postal system handles millions of letters monthly, understanding that maintaining morale requires keeping soldiers connected to home. Military censors read random samples of outgoing mail, checking for information that might compromise security, deleting passages that describe specific units or locations, occasionally confiscating entire letters that violate regulations. Lieutenant Hermann Bauer, assigned to censorship duty, reads letter after letter from soldiers desperate to communicate with families they haven't seen in months or years. Most letters contain nothing requiring censorship, just mundane details and expressions of longing, but occasionally Bauer encounters letters describing the true horrors of trench warfare, in terms that would shatter civilian morale. He blacks out these passages dutifully, understanding that the home front must be protected from knowledge that might undermine support for the war, even as he feels sympathy for soldiers whose words he's deleting. Artillery fire dominates the sensory experience of trench warfare, creating a constant background of explosions that ranges from distant thunder to earth-shaking concussions that collapse trenches and bury men alive. Gefreiter Franz Lehmann has learned to identify British artillery by sound, distinguishing the sharp crack of field guns from the deeper rumble of howitzers, recognizing the distinctive shriek of high-explosive shells that warns of incoming fire. When British artillery opens concentrated bombardment, Lehmann and his comrades huddle in the deepest dugouts they can find, pressing themselves against reinforced walls while the earth shakes around them. The bombardments last for hours or even days, making coherent thought impossible, reducing men to terrified animals waiting for the next shell to kill them. Lehmann has seen soldiers break under sustained bombardment, men who've survived months in the trenches suddenly screaming and running toward British lines in desperate attempts to escape the shells, cut down by machine gun fire, or captured by British soldiers who find them wandering no man's land in shock. Shell shock, called Kriegszittern or war tremors by German doctors, affects thousands of soldiers who've endured too many bombardments or witnessed too much death. Musketeer Otto Fischer begins experiencing tremors in his hands after surviving a direct hit on his dugout that kills 3 comrades while leaving him physically unharmed. The tremors worsen until he cannot hold his rifle steady, cannot eat without spilling food, cannot perform the basic tasks required of a soldier. Fischer reports to the aid station where Sanitätsgefreiter Toller examines him, finding no physical injuries but recognizing the psychological damage that bombardment inflicts. The treatment options are limited and often cruel, ranging from rest behind the lines for mild cases to electrical shock therapy for severe cases, treatment based on the theory that shell shock represents cowardice that can be cured through physical punishment. Fischer received 2 weeks rest at a casualty clearing station, returning to the front marginally improved, but carrying psychological scars that will never fully heal. Gas attacks represent a particularly terrifying weapon because they transform air itself into a lethal agent, forcing soldiers to don cumbersome gas masks that restrict vision and breathing, while providing uncertain protection. Gefreiter Karl Bauer, serving in a sector where British forces regularly employ chlorine and phosgene gas, keeps his gas mask within immediate reach at all times, practicing rapid donning until he can seal it over his face in under 5 seconds. The gas alarm, usually sentries beating on empty shell casings, sends men scrambling for masks, struggling to secure them properly while gas clouds roll across no man's land. Bauer breathes through the mask's filter, hearing his own breath loud in his ears, watching his surroundings through fogged lenses, feeling claustrophobic panic rising as the mask restricts his air supply. He knows that any leak in the mask's seal means inhaling gas that will blister his lungs and leave him drowning in his own fluids, so he checks the seal obsessively, pressing the mask tight against his face, ignoring the discomfort. Soldiers who fail to don their masks in time or whose masks prove defective suffer agonizing deaths or permanent injuries that leave them crippled for life. Sanitetskefreiter Tola treats gas casualties who arrive at the aid station choking and gasping, their faces blue from oxygen deprivation, their lungs damaged beyond repair. He can do little except administer morphine to ease their suffering and evacuate them to hospitals in the rear where they might survive, though many die during transport. The survivors carry permanent damage, lungs scarred by chemical burns, vision impaired by gas exposure, respiratory systems compromised so they can never again perform hard physical labour. Gas represents warfare at its most impersonal and inhuman, killing or maiming without discrimination, affecting brave and cowardly soldiers equally, creating injuries that offend human dignity. The preparation for assaults reveals the German army's systematic approach to offensive operations, combining detailed planning with aggressive execution to achieve breakthroughs that conventional attacks cannot produce. When orders arrive for an attack scheduled in 3 days, Hauptmann von Hentig's company begins intensive preparation, involving every soldier and every piece of equipment. Intelligence officers provide maps of British trenches based on aerial reconnaissance and patrol reports, marking machine gun positions, strongpoints, and sections of wire not destroyed by preliminary bombardment. Von Hentig assigns objectives to each platoon, explaining the overall plan so every soldier understands not just his individual task, but how it fits into the larger operation. This contrasts with British practice of limiting information to officers, reflecting German belief that informed soldiers fight more effectively than those who blindly follow orders. The assault troops prepare their equipment meticulously, each man carrying specific loads designed for his role in the attack. Stostrup teams, led by Unteroffizier Roth, carry bags of grenades. Engineers bring Bangalore torpedoes for destroying wire obstacles. Machine gunners struggle under the weight of their weapons and ammunition. Riflemen check their weapons and fix bayonets. Von Hentig inspects each man personally, checking that gas masks are functional, that ammunition pouches are full, that men understand their assignments. He speaks quietly to soldiers he knows are experiencing their first assault, offering reassurance without dishonesty, acknowledging their fear while explaining that training and discipline will carry them through. Some soldiers vomit from nervousness, others pray. Still others adopt a forced cheerfulness that fools no one. Von Hentig recognizes these as normal reactions to the knowledge that tomorrow some of them will be dead, accepting fear as the price of asking men to assault prepared positions, defended by machine guns and artillery. The assault itself, when it comes after a devastating artillery bombardment designed to destroy British defences, reveals both the effectiveness and limitations of German offensive doctrine. The artillery lifts at precisely the planned moment, and von Hentig's whistle sends his men over the parapet into no man's land. They advance in small groups, using the infiltration tactics that Stoßtruppen have perfected, rushing forward when British fire slackens, taking cover in shell craters when machine guns open fire, throwing grenades into dugouts before British defenders can emerge. Unteroffizier Roth leads his assault team directly at a British machine gun position, his men providing covering fire while he crawls to throwing range and lobs grenades that silence the weapon. The attack succeeds in penetrating the British front line, capturing 200 metres of trench and taking dozens of prisoners before British counterattacks, supported by artillery, force the Germans back to their starting positions. Von Hentig's company suffers 40% casualties, including 2 officers killed, losses that will take weeks to replace, all for temporary gains that cost more than they achieved. The survivors of the assault return to their trenches exhausted and traumatized, many experiencing their first exposure to the reality that modern warfare kills men with industrial efficiency. Gefreiter Franz Schulz, who watched his best friend cut in half by British machine gun fire, sits in the trench staring at nothing, unable to process what he's witnessed. The medical orderlies move through the trenches, providing what comfort they can, treating wounds, evacuating serious casualties, recording names of the dead for the chaplain, who will write letters to families. Hauptmann von Hentig, who lost 2 officers under his command, must write those letters himself, searching for words that can somehow explain to parents or wives that their sons or husbands died bravely in service to the fatherland. He knows these letters provide cold comfort, that no explanation can fill the emptiness their deaths create, but military tradition and personal honor demand that he write them honestly and personally. The rotation out of the front line after days of combat brings relief mixed with survivors' guilt, as men realize they've lived while comrades died. The march to rest areas behind the lines takes them through villages transformed into military support infrastructure, past field hospitals where wounded men cry out, past cemeteries that grow larger every day, past columns of fresh troops marching forward to replace the casualties. Gefreiter Müller, who has survived another rotation in the front line, feels simultaneously grateful to be alive and guilty that others died in his place. He wonders how long his luck will hold, whether the next rotation will see his name added to the casualty lists, whether he'll survive long enough to see the war's end. These thoughts he keeps to himself, knowing that voicing them serves no purpose and might undermine the morale of soldiers who need to believe survival is possible. The rest area offers simple pleasures that soldiers have learned to cherish. Hot food prepared in field kitchens rather than cold rations, opportunities to wash and shave, clean uniforms to replace those caked with mud and blood, letters from home delivered in bulk by postal orderlies. Müller spends an entire day sleeping, making up for weeks of fitful rest interrupted by sentry duty and bombardments. When he wakes, he writes letters home describing his health and asking about his family, carefully omitting any mention of the combat he's experienced or the friends he's lost. He visits the mobile canteen where soldiers can purchase tobacco, writing paper and other small luxuries using military currency, spending his pay on cigarettes that will make the next rotation slightly more bearable. These brief respites from the front line allow soldiers to maintain some connection to civilian life, to remember that they are human beings rather than merely instruments of warfare. The Christmas truce of 1914 represents a moment that many German soldiers remember with a mixture of nostalgia and pain, a brief period when the humanity of enemy soldiers became undeniable. Gefreiter Hans Werner, who participated in informal truces where German and British soldiers met in no man's land to exchange cigarettes and show photographs of families, describes the experience as both heartwarming and heartbreaking. The truces revealed that British soldiers were men like himself, fighting because their governments ordered them to fight, missing their homes and families just as he missed his. Werner found it impossible to hate these men after sharing Christmas carols with them, making the return to combat psychologically difficult. The High Command disapproved of these truces and eventually forbade them, understanding that soldiers who recognize their enemy's humanity make poor killers. By 1916, such fraternization has become rare, replaced by bitter hatred born of years of slaughter and the knowledge that the war will continue until one side achieves complete victory. The prospect of German victory seems increasingly distant as the war enters its third and fourth years, with the British blockade creating food shortages that weaken both military and civilian morale. Soldiers receiving letters from home learn that their families struggle to find adequate food, that children go hungry, that the civilian population suffers deprivations as severe as anything soldiers experience in the trenches. This knowledge corrodes morale more effectively than enemy action could, making soldiers question what they're fighting for if victory will return them to a country that can barely feed itself. Gefreiter Müller, reading letters from his wife describing their children's hunger, experiences rage at the government that led Germany into this war and despair at the seeming impossibility of victory. He shares these feelings with close comrades during quiet moments, knowing that expressing such doubts openly could result in court-martial for defeatism. The discipline that has held the German army together begins fraying, as 1918 brings military disasters and the realization that Germany cannot win. Rumors of mutiny in the navy and revolutionary activity in German cities reach the trenches, undermining the military hierarchy that depends on soldiers' faith in their leaders. Officers like Hauptmann von Hentig find themselves struggling to maintain order as men question orders that seem designed to achieve nothing beyond adding more names to casualty lists. The arrival of American forces in overwhelming numbers makes the strategic situation hopeless, yet the army continues fighting because discipline and duty remain powerful forces, even when victory becomes impossible. Soldiers continue manning their posts, following orders, attacking when commanded, not from belief in victory, but from the understanding that their alternative is to surrender Germany to her enemies. The final months of the war bring a desperate string of offensives as German High Command attempts to achieve breakthrough before American forces tip the balance irreversibly. The spring offensive of 1918 employs Stosstrup tactics on a massive scale, achieving spectacular initial successes that penetrate deeply into Allied lines before stalling due to exhaustion and overextended supply lines. Unteroffizier Roth participates in these offensives, watching his assault battalion shrink through casualties that cannot be replaced. Knowing that each attack consumes strength Germany no longer possesses, the offensives gain ground but fail to achieve decisive victory, leaving the German army weakened and vulnerable to Allied counterattacks that will eventually force the armistice. When the armistice finally comes in November 1918, soldiers experience emotions that defy simple description: relief at the end of slaughter, mixed with bitterness at defeat and betrayal at the terms imposed on Germany. Gefreiter Müller, who has survived 4 years of trench warfare, learns of the armistice while still in the frontline trenches, uncertain whether to celebrate survival or mourn the sacrifice that achieved nothing. The march back to Germany takes his unit through devastated French countryside, past ruins of villages and towns, past cemeteries filled with crosses marking graves of men who died for territory that will now be surrendered. Müller returns to his family fundamentally changed by his experiences, carrying psychological wounds that will never heal, unable to explain to civilians what the trenches were truly like. The legacy of German trench warfare extends far beyond World War I, influencing military doctrine and shaping German society for generations. The Stoßtrupp tactics developed in the trenches become the foundation for German military thinking in the interwar period, evolving into the Blitzkrieg doctrine that will characterize the next war. The emphasis on small unit initiative, combined arms coordination, and rapid infiltration that German soldiers perfected in the trenches of Flanders and France represents a revolutionary approach to warfare that other nations will struggle to counter. Veterans like Unteroffizier Roth carry these lessons into the Reichswehr and later the Wehrmacht, training new generations of soldiers in tactics born from the brutal classroom of trench warfare. The psychological impact of trench warfare on German veterans creates a generation of men who cannot fully reintegrate into civilian society. Gefreiter Müller returns to his farm in Bavaria, attempting to resume the life he left in 1914, but finds himself unable to connect with people who never experienced the trenches. He startles at loud noises, experiences nightmares that leave him screaming in his sleep, finds civilian concerns trivial compared to the life and death struggles of the front. His wife tries to understand, but the gulf between those who served and those who remained home proves unbridgeable. Müller joins veterans organizations where he can speak freely with men who share his experiences, finding comfort in the company of those who understand what the trenches demanded and what they took from those who survived. The physical cost of trench warfare manifests in hospitals and clinics throughout Germany, where men maimed by bullets, shells and gas struggle to find purpose in lives irreversibly damaged. Gefreiter Fischer, who lost both legs to a British artillery shell in 1917, learns to navigate the world on prosthetics that never quite fit properly, experiencing constant pain that doctors cannot adequately treat. He receives a disability pension that barely covers his expenses, forcing him to rely on family charity and veterans support organizations. Fischer represents hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who survived the war physically, but carry wounds that will never heal. Men whose sacrifice will be forgotten as Germany struggles with economic chaos and political upheaval in the 1920s. The discipline that sustained German soldiers through 4 years of trench warfare becomes both blessing and curse in the post-war period. The ability to endure hardship, to follow orders despite personal cost, to maintain unit cohesion under impossible conditions, serves veterans well in some contexts, but leaves them vulnerable to exploitation by political movements that offer purpose and camaraderie similar to what they experienced in the trenches. The Freikorps units that form in the war's aftermath attract veterans seeking the structure and brotherhood they lost with demobilization. Men who find civilian society chaotic and purposeless compared to the clear hierarchies of military service. These units, employing violence to suppress communist uprisings and participating in Germany's political struggles, demonstrate how the discipline learned in trenches can be redirected toward destructive ends when divorced from legitimate military authority. The mythology surrounding German trench warfare evolves in contradictory directions during the interwar period, with some veterans embracing narratives of noble sacrifice, while others reject war entirely as mass murder disguised as patriotic duty. Ernst Junger's memoir, Storm of Steel, presents trench warfare as a crucible that forged superior men through suffering, celebrating the Stoßtrupp warriors as embodiments of martial virtue. This romanticized vision appeals to Germans seeking to salvage meaning from defeat, transforming the trenches into settings where individual courage and unit cohesion demonstrated German superiority, even in losing cause. But other veterans, including those who wrote anonymously or published works critical of militarism, described trench warfare as industrialized slaughter that destroyed a generation for no purpose beyond satisfying the ambitions of political leaders who never experienced the front themselves. The technical innovations developed by German soldiers in the trenches receive less attention than they deserve in popular histories that focus on Allied contributions. The development of sophisticated trench systems, the creation of Stoßtrupp tactics, the integration of flamethrowers and light machine guns into infantry units, the emphasis on small unit leadership and initiative all represent German contributions to military art that influenced warfare throughout the 20th century. The concrete bunkers that German engineers constructed in Flanders proved so durable that many still stand today, monuments to the engineering skill and systematic preparation that characterized German military operations. These Stollen, reinforced with steel and concrete, containing multiple chambers and connected by tunnels, provided protection that saved countless German lives during Allied bombardments, demonstrating how intelligent defensive preparation could mitigate the advantages of superior artillery. The relationship between German soldiers and the high command that directed their efforts remains controversial among veterans and historians, who debate whether military leaders deserve credit for Germany's defensive successes or blame for offensive failures that consumed lives without achieving decisive results. Generals like Erich Ludendorff receive credit for understanding the potential of Stoßtrupp tactics and implementing them on a large scale, but also criticism for launching the 1918 spring offensives that exhausted Germany's remaining strength without achieving breakthrough. Soldiers like Gefreiter Müller have mixed feelings about their commanders, recognizing that officers shared the dangers of trench warfare while also believing that better strategy might have avoided some of the war's most pointless slaughters. The social composition of German trench units reflected the class structure of Imperial Germany, with officers drawn primarily from aristocratic and middle-class backgrounds, while enlisted men came from working-class and peasant families. This class division created tensions that military discipline normally suppressed, but occasionally erupted during the war's final months when revolutionary sentiment spread through the ranks. Hauptmann von Hentig, whose aristocratic background and professional military education placed him among the officer elite, maintained social distance from his enlisted men, partly from military tradition and partly from the class consciousness that characterized German society. But the shared experience of trench warfare created bonds that transcended class boundaries, with officers and enlisted men developing mutual respect based on competence and courage demonstrated under fire. Von Hentig's careful attention to his men's welfare, his willingness to share their dangers, and his professional competence earned loyalty that class difference alone could never command. The role of religion in sustaining soldiers through trench warfare varied enormously depending on individual background and the intensity of religious faith. Some soldiers like Gefreiter Anton Becker found comfort in prayer and religious services conducted by military chaplains who visited the trenches, believing that faith provided meaning to their suffering and hope for survival or salvation. Others lost whatever faith they possessed after witnessing the industrial slaughter of trench warfare, unable to reconcile belief in a benevolent God with the reality of men torn apart by high explosives or slowly suffocated by poison gas. The chaplains themselves struggled to provide spiritual comfort in an environment that seemed to mock religious teachings about divine providence and the sanctity of human life. Father Johannes Keller, a Catholic chaplain attached to a Bavarian regiment, spent 4 years administering last rites to dying soldiers, writing letters to families, and attempting to maintain morale through religious services that fewer and fewer men attended as the war dragged on. The holidays celebrated in the trenches provided brief respites from the routine of warfare, moments when soldiers attempted to maintain connections to civilian traditions despite their circumstances. Christmas proved particularly important to German soldiers, many of whom decorated their trenches with small trees and candles, sang traditional carols, and shared special rations saved for the occasion. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hofer describes Christmas 1916 in his sector, where his unit erected a small tree decorated with paper ornaments and candles, gathered to sing Stille Nacht, while British soldiers in opposing trenches sang their own carols, creating a moment of shared humanity amid the brutality. These celebrations could not erase the war's horrors, but they reminded soldiers that another life existed beyond the trenches, that traditions and families waited for their return, if they could only survive long enough. The mail censorship system, while necessary for military security, created frustration among soldiers desperate to communicate honestly with families about their experiences. Gefreiter Müller understood that censors would delete anything describing specific units, locations, or combat operations, forcing him to write in vague generalities that failed to convey the reality of trench life. He developed coded language to communicate with his wife, describing his health as good when conditions were tolerable and adequate when they were terrible, trusting she would understand the subtext. But this coded communication remained unsatisfying, leaving him isolated from the person he most wanted to share his experiences with, unable to explain how the war had changed him or what he was enduring. The prospect of leave, brief periods when soldiers could return home to visit families, represented the most precious reward the army could offer. Gefreiter Schmidt, who receives 10 days leave after 18 months continuous service at the front, experiences a disorienting mixture of joy and anxiety as he travels by train toward his hometown. The journey takes him from the devastated landscape of the front through increasingly normal countryside, where civilians go about daily lives, seemingly unaware of the slaughter occurring 100 miles away. Schmidt finds himself unable to relate to civilians, whose concerns about food prices and political debates seem trivial compared to the daily struggle for survival in the trenches. His family welcomes him enthusiastically, preparing special meals and treating him as a hero. But Schmidt feels like an imposter, knowing that his survival owes more to luck than heroism. He spends his leave trying to reconnect with his former life, while simultaneously counting days until he must return to the front, the only place where he feels he truly belongs. The experience of returning from leave to the front line proved psychologically devastating for many soldiers who had briefly tasted normal life. Gefreiter Schmidt's journey back to his unit reverses his leave journey, taking him from the familiar world of home through increasingly damaged landscape until he reaches the wasteland of the front. Each mile intensifies his dread as he approaches the trenches that have become his prison. When he finally reports to his company, his comrades welcome him back with a mixture of genuine pleasure at his return and dark humour about his having survived leave without dying in an accident. Schmidt slips back into trench routine quickly, discovering that the discipline and structure that seemed oppressive before his leave now provide psychological comfort, giving him purpose and distracting him from thoughts about the impossibility of surviving the war. The relationships between German soldiers and French civilians in occupied territories varied from hostile to surprisingly cordial, depending on circumstances and individual personalities. Some German units billeted in French villages during rest periods developed friendly relationships with civilians, who appreciated that occupation troops generally behaved correctly and paid for goods they requisitioned. Gefreiter Hans Werner, whose unit spent rest periods in a village behind the lines, became friendly with a French family who rented them rooms, sharing meals and attempting to communicate despite language barriers. These civilian contacts reminded Werner of humanity that existed beyond the trenches, that war involved more than just soldiers killing each other. But other soldiers viewed French civilians with suspicion or hostility, believing them to be spies or supporters of franc-tireur attacks, responding with harsh measures that created lasting bitterness. The winter of 1916 to 1917, one of the coldest on record, tested German soldiers' endurance in ways that enemy action could not match. Temperatures plunged below freezing for weeks, turning trenches into frozen ditches where standing water became ice that cracked underfoot. Gefreiter Ludwig Frank describes the misery of that winter, when inadequate clothing and insufficient heating made every day a struggle against frostbite and hypothermia. Soldiers wrapped themselves in anything they could find, wearing layers of newspaper under their uniforms for insulation, stuffing straw into their boots, wrapping their heads in scarves and balaclavas. Despite these measures, frostbite casualties mounted as exposure took its toll on men whose bodies had already been weakened by inadequate rations and constant stress. The cold made every task more difficult, freezing rifle bolts so they wouldn't work properly, making it impossible to dig frozen ground for improvements to trenches, increasing the misery that already characterized trench life. The influenza pandemic that swept through Europe in 1918 struck German trenches with devastating effect, killing soldiers who had survived years of combat. The virus spread rapidly through the close quarters of trenches and dugouts, affecting entire units simultaneously and overwhelming medical facilities already strained by combat casualties. Sanitätsgefreiter Toller watched helplessly as healthy young soldiers sickened and died within days, their immune systems compromised by malnutrition and stress, unable to fight the infection. The pandemic killed German soldiers by the thousands, at precisely the moment when Germany needed every man to counter Allied offensives, contributing to the military collapse that forced the armistice. The armistice negotiations and the eventual Treaty of Versailles created bitterness among German soldiers, who believed they had been betrayed by politicians and civilians, rather than defeated by Allied armies. The "stab in the back" legend that developed in the post-war period blamed Germany's defeat on internal enemies, rather than military failure, providing psychologically satisfying explanation for veterans who could not accept that their sacrifices had been in vain. Gefreiter Müller, returning to Bavaria after the armistice, encounters this narrative repeatedly in veterans' organizations and political meetings, finding it appealing, despite his understanding that Germany had been militarily exhausted by 1918. The legend allows him and other veterans to maintain pride in their service, while explaining away the defeat that makes their suffering seem purposeless. The final journey home from the trenches marked the end of one ordeal and the beginning of another, as German soldiers returned to a country transformed by revolution and economic chaos. The discipline that had sustained them through 4 years of warfare provided little guidance for navigating the political and social upheaval that characterized post-war Germany. Veterans found themselves economically marginalized, politically radicalized, and socially isolated, carrying psychological and physical wounds that would never fully heal. The trenches had made them into men who could endure almost anything, but had not prepared them for peace in a defeated nation, where their sacrifices seemed forgotten or actively despised by civilians who blamed the military for leading Germany into catastrophic war. The story of life in the German trenches is ultimately one of ordinary men enduring extraordinary hardships through discipline, fear, and the bonds of comradeship that develop among soldiers who share danger. They were not the monsters that Allied propaganda depicted, nor the superhuman warriors that German mythology would later claim, but men who did their duty as they understood it, suffered terribly, and carried the scars of their service for the rest of their lives. The trenches that stretched across Europe from 1914 to 1918 consumed a generation of German youth, transforming those who survived into men who could never fully return to the world they had left. Their legacy includes not just the tactical innovations they developed or the battles they fought, but the demonstration of what human beings can endure when discipline, duty, and survival instinct combine to overcome fear and maintain cohesion under conditions that should break anyone. The German soldiers who served in the trenches of World War I deserve to be remembered not as enemies or villains, but as men who faced industrial warfare's horrors with courage and discipline, surviving through 4 years of slaughter that changed warfare and humanity forever.